Hi, my name's Tom Coben. I'm a freelance 3D artist in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've been working in Cinema 4D for the past 10 years or so, creating visual effects and 3D renders for music video, short films, some concert visuals, and TV shows, including Creepshow and the Jimmy Kimmel Live show this past year. You might have seen some of my work floating around the internet in the form of a bowling robot or perhaps a horrifying spider train. But today I'm actually here to talk to you about creating some psychedelic environmental distortion effects using Cinema 4D and a little After Effects. But first, let's take a look at my reel. Alright, so today I'm mostly going to be breaking down this piece right here. This is a personal project of mine called Kicking In. I made it as part of the Distorted Reality NFT exhibition last spring through the Sevens Grant and the Get NFT group. Let's take a look at the full piece. And here's the second piece in the same series. This one's a bit more complex, but they both use the same basic setup to achieve the intense distortion. Alright, I'm going to show you how to set up a rig like this one and use a simple IK chain and mesh deformer to achieve this effect. Let's hop right in. Okay, so here we are in Cinema 4D, and this is our bathroom that I built. You can see that it's basically just an extremely long extruded bathroom, and it's some relatively simple geometry with some sinks and some urinals and whatnot. If I hit NB, you can see that it's actually pretty heavily subdivided. And that's so once we start deforming everything, let me turn off these lights. Once we start deforming everything, everything will move smoothly and we won't get any weird edges and stuff like that. So it's important that your high poly model is actually pretty heavily subdivided. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here is, let's go back into and hit NA. I'm going to create a low poly cage that's going to be the driver of our animation. So I'm going to bring in a cube. We're going to bring it into the center here and scale it up to roughly the same size as our environment here. I'm going to go to the side view so we can line it up, and that looks pretty good. And some pieces are sticking out, but honestly that's totally fine. It just has to be roughly the right size. Okay, so I'm going to hide our high poly geometry, and we're going to call this low poly driver, and we're going to give it some segments. We're going to add some subdivisions here. So on the Y, let's hit NB so we can see our lines. On the Y, let's give it 8 subdivisions by, let's do 9, and then on the Z-axis here, let's give it a bunch. I'm going to say 64. That looks good. The main thing you want to just be aware of here is that you want your polygons to be roughly square. It doesn't have to be perfect, but that looks good to me. Okay, so this is our low poly driver. We're going to hit C to make it editable. And the next thing we're going to do is create our joint chain. So let's go to our side view again. I'm going to go up into the character menu here, grab a joint. I'm going to pull it out to the side here, kind of put it in the middle of the room, and that's good. Now let's see, we're going to make a copy of it and drag it as a child. And this one we're going to move in the Z direction. We're going to move it 75 centimeters. And then we're going to take our first joint, holding Control, drag it under the second joint again. So now we have a joint chain of 4 joints, or 3 really. But we're going to do the same thing with this one selected. The new one we also hit 75. Now it's even longer, and we're going to repeat that process until it's as long as the actual room. So 75. Let's back out a bit. Then hit 75. We're going to copy it again. Drag it under, hit 75. We're getting close. We just need a couple more, so I'll just grab a few from the end here. Oops. And 75. Okay, and we've overshot by just a little bit. So let's. Okay, that looks good to me. Now, if you middle click the top one, you can see that we have 35 joints selected. So that's pretty good, I think. You don't want to have too many because sometimes it can get a little unwieldy, but I think 35 has worked for me in the past. So that's what we're going to do today. Okay, so let's put this in a null by hitting Alt-G, and we'll just call that joints. Okay, let's turn off our low poly driver so we can see our nice joint chain here. And what we want to do next is make our joint chain dynamic, and that's going to give our animation that nice fluid, trippy look. Let's right click on our first joint in our chain, go down to rigging tags, and add an IK tag. We're going to go to the tag here and grab the last joint in our joint chain and drag that into the end parameter. Next we go to dynamics and enable that. So what that's going to do is once we hit play, the whole thing's just going to flop down, which is cool, but that's not what we're looking for here, obviously. So to fix that, go back to frame 0, and we'll turn off gravity by inputting a 0. Now when we hit play, nothing's going to happen, and that's exactly what we want. So in order to actually animate our dynamic joint chain, we're actually just going to apply animation to the null that's holding our chain. You can see that even here in the viewport, you can grab the null, and our joint chain will follow along. And I'm not super happy with how that's looking currently, and we'll fix that in a second, but you can see that the motion follows along with the null. So we're just going to be applying animation there. You can either apply keyframes directly to the null, but I like to actually use a vibrate tag. So let's do that. We right click on the null, go to animation tags, and add a vibrate tag. And this will give you kind of just a nice organic movement. And you can do that either in position or rotation. I'm just going to do rotation for now. So at frame 0, I actually want a rotation of 0 and a frequency of 0.5. Let's add a keyframe to the amplitude. And maybe around frame 50 or so, let's go 10 by 10 by 0. And these are just some settings that I found that look nice. So now you can see if we start from frame 0, hit play, we're getting this nice organic rotation at the origin, and the rest of the chain is kind of just following along. And this green line is kind of distracting me, so let's get rid of that. So let's go to our IK chain, go to display, and turn off the handle line. Great. Okay. So let's mess with some dynamic setting, because I'm not really happy with how this is moving. It's a little too stiff and a little too fast. So we go into the Dynamics tab, and we can see that we have these settings here. Now we're really only going to be worrying about strength, drag, and rotation hold. The position hold I tend to leave as it is at 100%. Now when you're moving these around, it's kind of a balancing act. Sometimes you might increase one and then you'll have to decrease another, or you kind of just have to experiment until you get it kind of where you like it. In my case, I have found, I like having more drag because you can see it kind of slows things down. It kind of makes things feel like they're almost underwater. It gets just a nice smooth motion. So I have that a little higher. And in this case, we're going to go with a strength of 32, a drag of 33, and a rotation hold of 25. And that really slows things down quite a bit, but you kind of want it to stay subtle with this, because once you're inside the bathroom or whatever your scene is, a little bit of motion goes a long way, because you don't want it to you don't want it to be too hard to follow, and you'll see what I mean in a second. Okay, so I think this is looking good. One other thing, I want to go back to our vibrate tag, and right around here, right around now, actually about halfway through our timeline, I'm going to hit another keyframe, go forward another 50 or so frames, and set it back down to 0. And what that's going to do is I want to give this time to settle down to the end of the so by the end of the animation, I want it to loop perfectly. And so if I hit play now that there's no more rotation, there's still going to be some inertia left over, so that's going to finish that off and hopefully kind of come to rest in the exact position it started in. And that looks pretty good. We might actually move this just a little sooner. Oops. So this is over the course of 500 frames, or however many you need. I just want to give time for it to settle in place. So when it loops, it looks perfect, and that looks good to me. Great. Okay, so now that that's looking good, let's go ahead and actually bind our joint chain to our low poly driver. So to do that, we can middle mouse click on our first joint in a chain, and that'll select all of them. You can see they're all selected here. And then we can control click on the low poly driver, so these are all selected now. We go to the character tab and click bind. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a skin object underneath our low poly driver and give it a weight tag. And if we double click on that, we can see that it's bound to our joints here. It's this cool rainbow color. So yeah, let's just see what it looks like right now if we hit play. Cool, so that's looking good. It's applied our motion to the low poly driver, although we're getting some kind of weird artifacts here. It's not very smooth. So one thing I like to do is select our object, go Shift C and bring in our weight manager, and I just want to select smooth in our mode here and apply that to everything. And that kind of just, it might be hard to see, but it kind of has smoothed out. I'm going to click it a few times. It just smooths out our weights. So now if we click off and hit play again, you can see that it's a lot smoother. There's less of those little weird artifacts. And that's going to help when we apply this to our high poly mesh. All right, so now that we've built our main low poly driver for this animation, let's go ahead and grab our joints and our low poly driver geometry and group those together. We'll call that driver just for organizational purposes. And now what we want to do is apply the animation, this nice fluid, cool animation, to our high poly mesh. So we're going to do that by using the mesh deformer, which is a really cool deformer. You can find it right up here in the Deformers tab. You can go down to Mesh Deformer, and there it is. What I want to do is, let's hide our driver for now, bring out our high poly model, and let's go ahead and grab our high poly geometry and put that inside of another null, and we'll call that high poly geo. And we're going to put the mesh deformer as a child of that and a sibling of the high poly geometry. I'm going to go into NA to get rid of the lines. Now, what the mesh deformer allows you to do, again, is to inherit the motion of a lower poly model. So it won't have to calculate all of the massive amount of subdivisions that's in here. It'll just be applied using the motion of the other model. So it's really awesome, super fun. So the way it works is you're going to want to go into your driver. You have this cages input here, and we're going to drag in the low poly driver right into that box. And now, before we hit initialize, you want to do two things. First, it's always good to save, because I've had this crash on me before, especially if you have a lot of geometry in here. If it's a bigger scene or whatever, it can definitely crash on you. So go ahead and save. And the other thing you need to do is, under the Advanced tab, go down to the external option here, and instead of ignore, make sure that's on surface area. And what that's going to do is, basically, let's turn on our driver again. If this wasn't selected, if it was back on ignore, basically anything outside of the bounds of this box of our low poly geometry mesh will not have the mesh deformer applied to it, and it'll get all wonky. As soon as there's moving, these things will stay where they are, and it'll stretch out and look bad. So if we hit surface area, though, these will inherit kind of the motion of what's close by to them. So that's what we want. And so now let's go ahead and hit initialize. It might take a second depending on how big your scene is and how much geometry you have. In this case, it's nice and quick, so that's cool. You can see it's cached into memory. Just hit another save. And now let's see. Let's turn off. You can see that our low poly driver has been given a display tag to make it see through, but I should want to just turn it off so we don't have to look at it. I'm going to go ahead and turn off our joints as well. All right, let's get into place here, and I'm going to turn on these lights so we can see a little better, and let's hit play and watch what happens. Okay, that's looking pretty great. We have now inherited the motion from the low poly driver using the mesh deformer, and it's been applied to this high poly model, and it's actually moving in pretty much real time, which is awesome. It means that it's still very parametric. We can still actually zoom out, and I'm going to turn these lights back off. We can literally grab the joints and move it around, and in the viewport, the actual high poly geometry is moving in basically real time, and that's awesome. I think this might not be the case for every scene. Some scenes might be a lot heavier, so this might not be possible. And if that is the case, you can actually just turn off the mesh deformer and continue art directing just on the low poly driver, and then once you're ready to render, just turn the mesh deformer back on. So next I want to take a look at some other deformers we can actually use in conjunction with the mesh deformer. And let's take a look at the original animation again. So as you can see, there's a wave of distortion that comes at the camera before the actual IK chain starts moving the entire scene around. So let's go ahead and build that. Okay, so let's turn back off our high poly geo and bring back in our low poly driver. Again, that's how we're going to be applying this deformer. And then that animation is again being routed through the mesh deformer and being applied to the high poly geometry. Okay, so let's bring in a displacer deformer, and we're going to add that above our low poly driver. I'm going to add a noise to that. I want to increase the scale of the noise to like 1,000. In the object tab, let's increase the height so we can kind of see what it's doing here. That's looking good. And then in our fall off, we're going to add a spherical field, and that's just going to limit where we can see the actual effect of this deformer. Great. Okay, so that's looking good. I'm going to move it over. I'm going to let's give ourselves 100 more frames, and I'm going to shift the keyframes that we put on our jiggle deformer, so that doesn't start until after this deformer has resolved its animation. So I'm going to move it out 100. Grab the spherical field. I'm just going to keyframe this from 0 to about 100. Move that across. You can see as it goes, it's cool, but it's not very fluid. So we're gonna move it across here. Let's hit play. You can see what it's doing, but I want there to be some secondary motion there. So we're also going to add a Shift C and add a delay, and then put that below the displacer, and in the Deformer tab, click this, put this to point, and set the effector to spring and give it a pretty high number. And then now when I hit play, you get this nice organic springiness. I might actually bring that delay down just a little bit. That might be a bit much for me. Yeah, that's feeling better. I'm going to bring our keyframes of our vibrate tag back over just a little bit. I want it to kind of start as the waves are kind of dying down. And let's turn off our low poly driver again, bring in our high poly again, geo, and I'm gonna hide our spherical field, and let's just see how that looks right now. Turn these lights back on. Great, yeah, that's looking good. It's a little heavy, so we can turn down the displacer intensity a bit, or the height. Let's take it to 30 and see how that looks instead. Great, that's looking a lot better to me. Okay, so now that this is feeling good, let's say we wanted to add some different models to our scene. If we bring in, say, a figure, put him on the floor, and we hit play, nothing's going to happen because he's not attached to anything. So in order to have him be part of the scene, you have to, let's make him editable. Let's bring him down into our high poly geo null, and then you have to reinitialize every time you add a new model to the scene. So let's go ahead and do that. Initialize, I'll take a second. There we go, and then now if we hit play, you can see that he's being deformed along with the rest of the scene. Okay, so we've just learned how to add additional static models into our high poly geometry, but there's a very slightly different workflow for adding an animated model. So for instance, let's get rid of our figure here, and let's bring in this dude here, looking great. And let's say we want to have this guy just jamming out in the bathroom. So let's grab him, pop him in. Now let's position him as we want him. He'll obviously be looking at himself in the mirror. Let's move him over here. Perfect. So he'll just be chilling here as the world goes crazy around him. Cool. Okay, so let's bring him into our high poly geo null. And if we just do as we did before, hit initialize, let's see what happens. When we hit play, the geometry is still deforming, but his animation isn't moving. He's moving along with it, and it's all good there, but he's obviously not thrusting as hard as he could be right now. So what you have to do, instead of just hitting initialize, you have to also check this auto initialize, and that'll basically refresh every frame. Now this can in this case, it's actually a pretty light scene still. Like I can still play it, and it's still going. It's not going real time, but it's going enough where you can actually see what's happening. But I've had it before where if you have a more high poly detailed model, or depending on just the amount of animation that's going on, it could really slow down your scene. So I would recommend doing this last if this is, or at least once you already have locked down what kind of animation you want for the whole scene. But this is obviously looking pretty good now, so I'm just going to add a few more of these guys, and let's take a look at what it looks like rendered. Great, looking good, not weird at all, and they're sticking to the floor really nice, and they're keeping their animation, so great. I think this might be a masterpiece. So a couple other things to note with this type of setup. You can't actually have a light object follow along in this method, right? So you can't just drop a light into our geometry and hit going to initialize because it won't follow along. It'll just stay where it is. The way, so in these cases, I actually just had light emissive textures on actual geometry that are attached to our rig here. You can see that these overhead lights are just geometry, and they emit light into the scene. But if you really wanted to add a light object, for instance, an octane light, into the scene and have it and make sure it follows along. Here's a method that you could use, and this also would apply to any other model that if it's not working well with the mesh deformer, or you just wanted to do something slightly different, this method could also work. So let's say we wanted to add this octane light over here. And make sure that it follows along, right? So first things first, let's put it into a null, and I'll just say light null. What I'm going to do is add to the null, I'm going to add a rigging tag, constraint, and we're going to add a clamp constraint. And what we're going to basically do is clamp this null to the surface of the ceiling object, which will be deformed using the mesh deformer. So we can go in our clamp, go to origin, change that to surface. And we're going to drag in our ceiling, and now you can see we have this distance slider, and I'm going to move this so it's kind of just right on the surface there, and then I'm going to lock position. So now if we hit play, we can see as the rim starts to deform, the light kind of moves along with it, although there is kind of a bit of a delay, and it seems to be kind of floating a little bit. Also, we are passing out of the room. You can see that it's not exactly stuck. It's following along, but just a bit. So let's reset here. We go back to frame 0. I'm going to, in our constraint tag, we're going to go to basic, and under the priority, we're going to change that to generators and edit to change it to 1 there. Okay, so now as it plays through, we can see that it's now following along, but just the position, the rotation is still not working. Oops, if you can see it, it's kind of just kind of following along there. So to fix that, all we have to do is go a couple of things. We go into our clamp again. In the mode, instead of fix position, let's fix axis, and then let's do as Phong normal and say use normals. So now if we hit play, you can see that it's following along based on the actual rotation, and as it starts moving a bit more, it's actually following along there. It's not perfect. This is still kind of a workaround, because obviously like the light itself has no geometry, so it's still going to be a flat plane, whereas this is actual geometry, these overhead lights, and they will deform with the scene. So I think this method is probably more physically accurate, but if you need to use a light or need to attach a different object to the scene that's not working with the mesh deformer, then that's how you would go about it. Okay, the next thing I want to cover in this video is how I created the puddle texture on the floor of the bathroom here. So you can see that there's all these puddles which are procedurally generated as part of a texture on the floor. They reflect the light really nice, and it just looks pretty cool, and it's actually pretty customizable. When I initially started this project, I thought that I would just model out some puddles manually by drawing a spline and extruding it, but when I merged that with the mesh deformer, like with all the other geometry here, I found that it would actually clip through the floor in weird places, and because it was actually an object, it kind of deformed very slightly differently than the floor, and you could only tell because they were basically intersecting, and it just looked weird. So I decided to tackle this as a texture instead. So let's just do a quick rundown of how that works. All right, here we are back in Cinema 4D. I'm going to be using Octane for this material, but I think the principles here should apply to Redshift or other renderers as well. So right off the bat, we have just a plane, just so we can see what we're doing, and some lights, just for the reflections on the ground and stuff. This material here is from Grayscale Gorilla. It's one of their tile textures, and it's very nice. It has some good surface imperfections, and looks very cool, so shout out to them. Okay, let's bring in a Octane Mix Material and an Octane Glossy Material. We're going to call the Glossy Material Puddles, And I'm going to go ahead and replace our tiles texture with our mix material. So it's just going to turn white, which is fine. Let's double click on our mix material here, and let's bring in our puddles on the top and our tiles on the bottom. And I'm going to open up our node editor. You can see what's happening here. We have our puddle texture on the top and our tiles on the bottom. Okay, so right now everything's being controlled by a float slider, which is not what we want, because that's just ramping from 0 to 100% of either the puddles or the tiles. So let's delete that and add instead a Octane Noise. Plug that right in. I'm going to increase our contrast to 155 and our gamma to about 0.8. And then I'm going to invert that, because this is actually the opposite of what I want. So now you can see this is where our puddles are going to be. Right now they're a little bit small, so let's increase the scale just a bit. Added a UV transform node there. And this is feeling pretty good to me, maybe just even a little bit more. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so let's give the puddles themselves a little bit of texture. So let's add an Octane Noise, plug that in. I'm also going to increase the contrast here to about 10, and this just gives some kind of lighter and darker spots on the puddles themselves to kind of give them some depth. And I want to control the color of those with an Octane gradient, so it'll just ramp the white and black to different colors as you want. I'm going to ramp the black. I'm going to show you, change this, the order of this, but make the black kind of a light yellow, get rid of the white here, and make the other side a kind of a darker kind of brown, maybe even a little darker and a little less saturated. Yeah, that's feeling gross. Cool. Okay, so right now we basically have an opaque puddle. This looks pretty bad. So let's bring in a multiply node, and we're going to multiply that gradient with the actual bitmap texture from the tile material here. Add that as the second texture, and then put that in the diffuse. And so now you see we're effectively seeing the tile through the puddle itself, and while inheriting the color from this gradient. Okay, so this is looking very flat still. So what we're going to do is we have our noise that's driving where the puddles are. Grab from the invert node. We're going to plug that into the bump. And as soon as you do that, you can see that it basically lifts the puddle off the ground. You get this nice effect. Our puddles are still far too shiny, but it's a nice detail here. And that's basically the bones of this whole effect here. So let's add some roughness to our puddle. I'm just going to add an Emissive Texture, and I've been using the Travis David's Surface Imperfection pack. So I've been using this goopy one, which is kind of nice. And I'm going to go ahead and, you can't really see it right now. You can see it a little bit. So let's scale that down just a bit. Add a UV transform node, grab that, and shrink it down. And this kind of just gives, it breaks up the surface, and it also just kind of gives this nice kind of scummy texture on the top. And that's pretty much it. And this is nice because you can play with the noise, you can change the octaves, you can give tons of different looks. Change the gamma, you can kind of have it spread, which is kind of cool. It might not update immediately. You might have to refresh, but here we just have like a floor that's covered in puddles instead of. But if we bring that back down, it's kind of more manageable here. The other thing that's nice is that you can change the colors as much as you want. So maybe you don't want it to be pea, maybe you want it to be some slime, or make it green, make it maybe it's a crime scene, make it red, turn it into blood. The roughness channel on this is actually looking maybe a little too strong, so you can actually just go into the roughness node here, or into their image texture node, and take the power down, and that's one way to control kind of the surface of here. So there you go, that's the puddle setup for this texture, and I found it's a very nice way of working. Alright, so next up I want to cover some of the techniques that I used inside of After Effects to kind of polish the render here and kind of give it that sort of psychedelic, trippy look, in addition to the actual 3D motion that we have. So we have some of this kind of surface detail that's kind of breathing and moving, and some of the some of these lighting effects and stuff. So I just want to break that down, and let's take a look. All right, so here we just have our raw render, no filters applied. And to start out with, I'm going to want to select our layer, and we're going to add a vector blur. So you can search it up here in the effects. And I'm going to apply that. Now, vector blur is very cool. As you increase the amount, you can sort of see that it sort of starts pinching things while retaining some of the detail. And that's something I really liked. So what we're going to do, we're going to increase our ridge smoothness to like 20. If we increase the amount of blur, let's take it to like 30. You can see that things are starting to kind of bulge out. And if you actually, if we take the angle offset and sort of scrub through that, we can see that things start kind of, especially look at the tiles here, things start kind of spinning around and moving. And it's just this kind of very organic, kind of psychedelic feeling filter. So basically, all you have to do is alt click on the stopwatch here and put a little expression time times let's say 100. Okay, so we just rendered out that vector blur for a little bit, and it's already looking very cool. You can see that we have this nice kind of organic breathing kind of undulating effect on the ground. If we kind of especially see it at the beginning, the tiles are kind of spinning around and the lights are kind of moving. So it's a very cool, I love this effect already, but on top of that, I want to add an adjustment layer, and let's go ahead and add a prism displacement from Red Giant. Right away it looks insane, so let's bring down the glass refraction to like 0.1. Or let's say 0.2. Split the difference. Okay, so that's also looking cool. And you can see that this, if we turn this on and off, it kind of just pushes everything around in a neat way and kind of get these nice little refractions. So let's go ahead and add another one, another adjustment layer. Actually, let's call this Prism. And oops, move it back up. And we'll call this one CC Glass, because that's what we're going to be putting on there. And CC Glass. Okay, add that on. And you can see that this kind of just pushes it a little bit farther, and it also gives this kind of nice, almost an additional 3D effect. You can see that we have some controls over like the light direction. This is basically it's like a semi 3D effect, so you can move around the light, and as we do, we can see it kind of shift across these surfaces. And I'm going to go ahead and add another expression. So alt click on the stopwatch here, add another time expression. Let's do time times 80. And I'm going to go ahead and render this, and let's take a look and see what it looks like. All right, so I've rendered that out. I've added a few keyframes to kind of ramp it up. And here we go. It's pretty strong right now. I think it's a little heavy, but you know, whatever, that's cool. This guy just took a little too much, but that's fine. So to finish this off, I mean, that's most of the effect there. But to finish it off, let's add another adjustment layer. And I'm going to go ahead and add, oops, stop this from playing. Let's just move over here. I'm going to go, it's a Red Giant Universe filter called Chromatic Aberration. So let's add that to this adjustment layer, and you can see this gives this very kind of focused effect in the middle with this nice kind of colored refraction kind of look on the sides with kind of a lens blur as well. This is far too strong for me, so I'm going to do 0.1. So that's cool, and then after that, while we also have chromatic already selected, let's grab the Chromatic Glow as well. Also very strong. So let's bring that, bring the intensity down to let's see what 0.2 looks like. And there you go. That if we turn that on and off, you can see that just kind of gives it a nice, this very cool kind of glow. So that's the basics of the filters that I used. Let's take a look at the original one more time. And as you can see, it's actually going to look a little bit different than what we just did, but it's just kind of from tweaking the different parameters. And I've added some magic bullet looks and a couple other things, but the basics are all there. It's mainly driven just by the the vector blur, the ZZ glass, and the prism displacement. And as you can see, it all gets keyframed back off at the end there, so we can loop correctly. All right, last but not least, I want to cover this this next shot here, which is another kind of trippy psychedelic shot. It's actually done in a sort of different way than within the bathroom, in that this is mainly just driven by a simple wind deformer. There's no IK involved. But I mainly want to talk about the ground texture here and how I got it to get this kind of organic, flowy, trippy kind of look. And so let's hop back into After Effects, and I can show you how it works. All right, here we are back in After Effects. I've opened up a new comp with a color map. As you can see, this is a color map from Real Displacement Textures. I've downscaled it from 4K to 2K because it'll be much easier to work with at that size. And for this purpose, we don't actually need to get super close to it. So that's fine. It also included, so there's a color map. There's also a height map for displacing the material, and a normal map as well. The basics of this technique is we're going to be applying several filters to these maps in After Effects, and then exporting them as image sequences, and then we can use those image sequences back in Cinema 4D and Octane as the color, height map, and normal maps, but they'll just be animated. And then this just gives you kind of more flexibility. It gives you kind of more options to do some cooler animations that you can control through After Effects. It obviously bakes everything in, so it's not as procedural, and it takes some time, but it does create a very cool effect. So let's jump in. First off, we're going to add a new adjustment layer, and we're going to add a Turbulent Displace. So let's search for that, add Turbulent Displace. And right off the bat, you can see that it gets pretty squiggly, which is cool. We can adjust the amount and adjust the evolution. You know, if you move it really nice and slow, you can sort of see that this is just a much more subtle kind of effect than, you know, like the bathroom that was kind of all over the place and not particularly realistic for an actual psychedelic experience, or, you know, so I've been told. So anyway. Let's go ahead and take our amount down to 25 here, and we have our composition set to 99 frames long, and that's because I want it to loop on the 100th frame and loop back on itself, because our full animation is 500 frames long in this case, and so I'm keeping that in mind to because I want this to loop 5 times during the animation instead of having it be animated the entire time. That would just take too long to render from After Effects. Anyway, okay, so let's go ahead and add a keyframe of the evolution at the very beginning, and then move to frame 99, or 98, I guess, and set the evolution to 1 full revolution. And let's see our keyframes. I'm actually going to move this 1 frame up. So right off the bat, if we hit play, it's going to go all the way through, but it doesn't. There's a hard jump there. It doesn't loop correctly. So we just have to go into our evolution options and turn on cycle evolution. Click on that checkbox, and right now it's already correct. We have a value of 1 in here, which just means after 1 revolution of this rotation parameter, it will loop back on itself. So now if we hit play, that looks good. It's now looping perfectly. Okay, great. So let's turn that off for the moment. The next filter that I want to apply to our color map, we're actually going to select that directly, is the Liquify Effect. And the Liquify Effect is a very cool filter. It allows you to kind of push pixels around. If we like just kind of click and drag and move them, it's a very organic effect. It's very cool. We're actually going to be using just the bloat effect for right now, but honestly, you can use any of these. They're all very cool. I'm going to bring up our brush size. Let's zoom in a little bit. I'm going to find some of these kind of mossy areas, if you kind of just click and drag, you can see that it kind of really bloats out. That's too much, but you can actually bring your brush pressure down, maybe to like 30. I'm just going to drag, if you select it again, going to drag across and kind of dilate some of these kind of mossy areas. I think that looks kind of cool. One thing to note when you're doing this, make sure that you don't use the Liquify effect close to the border of your object, or of your composition rather, because if I started bloating this side here, this is a tileable texture, and so now this section will no longer line up with its with its other side here. So just be careful when you're using this brush not to affect any of the pixels along any of the edges, basically. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just add a few more brush strokes along here, find any areas that I think would look cool, kind of dilating. And as you can see, it's kind of a heavy effect as well. This is another reason we wanted this to be a 2K map, just because this effect can be kind of slow. The more brush strokes you do, the longer it will take per frame to calculate if you're animating it, which we will be. So just kind of, use it sparingly, or just be ready to have it be a long render time, possibly. So anyway, if let's say we were happy with that, I'm going to go ahead and we can take our distortion percentage and bring it on, turn it on and off. This is obviously, a little subtle. We can't really see too much of it, but I'll show you a finished version in a second. But let's go to the center of our composition, keyframe our distortion percentage to 100%, go to the start, set that to 0, and to the end, and set that to 0 as well. And this is just so this will also loop perfectly, because we want it to loop at the start and end of the animation here. I'm going to select my keyframes and hit F9 to easy ease them. So now as we scrub through, we can see that the Liquify is being applied on these areas. Again, this is you should take more time to mess with this than I did. But here is a finished version. You can see that this loops perfectly, and you can see some areas, like here, that's kind of dilating in and out, and there's a few other spots here and there. It's a pretty subtle effect, but you can go nuts with it if you want. But I just wanted it to kind of be simple for right now. So the next step, so let's turn back on our displacement texture, or turbulent displace rather. And what you're going to do now is basically just render this out. So you can hit Control M to bring it into the render queue and save this as a PNG sequence or a TIFF sequence or whatever you want. But make sure it's an image sequence, because then you can reuse it. It can be read in Octane or whatever renderer you're using. So once that's rendered out, you're going to want to do the exact same thing to the height map and the normal map, and it's imperative that you use the same settings, because you want the same distortion to be applied across all of the different channels. So you could create a new comp. Let's duplicate our color, and we'll call it, this will just be our normal, and let's open that up. And all you have to do is select the color layer, grab our normal from up here, and we're going to drag it right on top and hold Alt and then release. And then the exact same animation will be applied to the normal map. You'll render that out as an image sequence, and then do the exact same thing again for the height map. All right, we're back in Cinema 4D using Octane here. We have just a simple plane that we're going to use to see our texture here. I've got a Octane glossy material that I'll apply to our plane. And let's open up the node editor so we can see what's going on. Okay, so in the diffuse channel, let's bring in an image texture. And I already have our image sequence lined up here. So we'll just grab the first one, bring that in. You can see that it's been applied here, so looking good. We're going to want to go into the animation tab up here. Change this to 24 frames, because that's what our frame rate is in this scene, and hit calculate. And so this is going to from 0 to 99 frames. We actually are at 120 frames right now, so let's change this to 99 as well, just so we can actually have it loop perfectly. We're going to copy paste our image texture. Let's grab that, go back to shader, grab our normal map. So this is our normal map that we also exported out. Bring that in, hit, say no there, drag that into the normal, animation, it's still calculated to be correct, so that looks good. And then let's go to displacement, bring in a displacement node, copy and paste our image texture, and drag in our depth map. And let's do that now. Okay, and then we'll connect that to our displacement. And let's bring up the displacement just a bit. Make it really obvious what's going on. And let's change our resolution here to be 2K. And you can see now that it's already, even if you scrub through, you can see that it's distorting, and the depth, even the depth map is distorting along with the color and normal maps. So it's a pretty unique effect that would be very difficult to get inside of Cinema alone, which is why I like doing it this way. Before we render, I'm going to just bring down the specular a little bit, change that to a dark gray, and bring up our roughness. Since we don't have actual maps there for now, you could have done this with the actual maps too, but I didn't. I just wanted to use the 3 for now. So that looks good to me, and let's give this a render and see how it looks. All right, cool. So yeah, this is looking pretty sweet to me. I love the kind of flowy motion of everything. We can see we got some nice kind of dilation patterns in the moss over here, and yeah, I just kind of love the general look. And let's take a look at it in the final animation one more time. Here you can see it again, kind of in context, and it really just gives that kind of amazing, trippy, kind of ethereal feel. I feel like I've pretty much just scratched the surface here with using the Liquify tool to export out materials that you can use back in Octane, but I think there's a lot of potential there, and I'd love to see what people can come up with using this type of method. Alright, well that pretty much wraps it up for this presentation. If you have any other questions about any of these techniques, or just want to talk about Cinema 4D, feel free to reach out to me anytime on Twitter or Instagram at Tom Coben. I also have a YouTube channel, which is just Tom Coben, so feel free to check that out as well. I just want to give a big thanks to everybody at Maxon, and a thanks to all the presenters that I've learned so much from over the years. I've never really had any formal 3D training. I've pretty much just been a solo freelancer watching tutorials my entire career, so it's been extremely helpful, and I think this particular community has been so generous with this knowledge, so thank you for that. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to give back just a little bit and kind of contribute to that little wall of knowledge. So with that, I hope you've learned something today, and thank you.